September 29th, 1833. The royal palace of Madrid is silent, too silent. In a dimly lit chamber, King Ferdinand VII of Spain lies on his deathbed writhing in pain. His body is covered in oozing sores. His breath reeks of decay. At just 48 years old, he is dying not from war or assassination, but from syphilis, a disease he contracted through decades of relentless, unchecked debauchery. The man who styled himself defender of the faith and restorer of order spent his reign not in prayer, but in perversion. He turned the Spanish court into his personal brothel, using royal power to coerce, blackmail and humiliate women, wives, nuns, servants, nobles. 4 marriages, 4 young brides. 3 died under suspicious circumstances, broken in body and spirit. The 4th survived only because Ferdinand was already too sick to torment her. He betrayed his country to Napoleon, abandoned his people during invasion, and reinstated the Inquisition, not out of piety, but to wield it as a tool of sexual extortion. While Spain lost its empire, its economy collapsed, and its colonies rebelled, Ferdinand VII cared for only one thing: satisfying his ever-growing appetite for domination and degradation. History remembers him as El Deseado, the desired one. But those who suffered under him knew the truth. He was not desired. He was feared, loathed, endured. So how did a prince of royal blood become Europe's most depraved monarch? How did absolute power twist a man into a monster who used the crown not to rule, but to rape? This is the story of Ferdinand VII, not as a king, but as a predator, the most perverted king in history. Ferdinand was born on October 14, 1784, into a Spain that still believed itself a great power, but behind the gilded facade of the Bourbon court, rot had already set in. His father, King Charles IV, was a weak-willed monarch more interested in hunting and clockmaking than governance. His mother, Queen Maria Louisa of Parma, was infamous across Europe, not for her wisdom or grace, but for her endless string of lovers. Contemporary diplomats, including the French ambassador François de Beauharnais, described her court as a brothel disguised as a palace, where influence was traded not through policy, but through pillow talk. Chief among her paramours was Manuel Godoy, a handsome, ambitious soldier of humble origins who rose from royal bodyguard to prime minister in less than a decade, thanks entirely to the Queen's favour. Godoy didn't just share the Queen's bed, he shared her power, signing decrees, appointing bishops, and even directing foreign policy. Young Ferdinand watched this closely. To him, it wasn't a moral failing. It was a masterclass in realpolitik. If a commoner could rule a kingdom through a woman's affection, then power wasn't about birthright or virtue. It was about control over bodies. From the very beginning, the palace taught him that loyalty meant nothing, morality was a performance, and desire could buy you control. Ferdinand's earliest memories weren't of lessons or ceremonies, but of whispered affairs, drunken banquets, and the sound of his father as resigned sighs as Godoy strutted through the throne room like a king. Even as a child, Ferdinand displayed deeply disturbing tendencies. At just 10 years old, he was known to torture animals for amusement, tying stones to cats' tails, locking birds in ovens, laughing as they screamed. The Marquis of Caballero, his childhood chamberlain, later wrote in his memoirs that the prince once forced a stable boy to eat live mice to prove his obedience. Servants who displeased him were humiliated in public, made to bark like dogs, wear donkey ears, or crawl on hands and knees while Ferdinand rode on their backs. When his tutors, men like the enlightened scholar Juan de Escóiquiz, tried to instill discipline or moral reasoning, they were swiftly dismissed. Escóiquiz himself was exiled to a remote monastery after confronting the prince about his cruelty. No one dared challenge the heir to the throne. His education was a farce. While princes across Europe, like Britain's future George IV or Russia's Alexander I, studied philosophy, law, military strategy and languages, Ferdinand rejected books, mocked art, and showed utter contempt for matters of state. He could barely write a coherent sentence in French or Latin, and once threw a volume of Montesquieu into the fireplace, declaring, "I'll never need laws, I'll make them." Instead of history, he studied human weakness. He ordered secret peepholes drilled into the walls of private chambers, not just in guest quarters, but in the royal apartments, so he could watch courtiers undress, argue, or make love. Privacy to him was not a right. It was a weakness to be exploited. By his teens, Ferdinand had already fathered at least one illegitimate child with a palace maid, a fact quietly covered up by Godoy to avoid scandal. But the damage was done. In this toxic hothouse of corruption, cruelty and sexual intrigue, a future king was shaped, not by duty, but by depravity. The court didn't raise a ruler, it raised a predator, and soon that predator would inherit a kingdom. Ferdinand's first marriage, in 1802, was orchestrated by his parents and ministers as a last-ditch effort to civilize him. He was 18, his bride, Maria Antonia of Naples, just 15, intelligent, deeply devout, and raised in the refined courts of the Bourbon II Sicilies. She arrived in Madrid with hopes of partnership, even affection. Instead, she was handed to a predator. Court records, including encrypted letters from her lady-in-waiting Donna Elvira, describe how Ferdinand subjected her to humiliating sexual demands from their very first night. He mocked her prayers, forced her to perform degrading acts while he watched with detached amusement, and once locked her in a cold chamber for refusing to participate in what she called unnatural rites. To Ferdinand, her virtue wasn't admirable. It was an obstacle to be broken. Maria Antonia withdrew into solitude, spending her days in prayer and her nights in dread. She avoided court functions, feigned chronic illness, and wrote desperate letters to her mother, Queen Maria Carolina of Naples, begging to be rescued. "I live in a gilded cage," she wrote in 1804, "guarded by a man who sees me not as a wife, but as a thing to be used." But political alliances outweighed compassion. No escape came. In 1806, at just 21 years old, she died. Officially, the cause was tuberculosis, a common verdict for royal deaths shrouded in scandal. Unofficially, whispers spread through European courts. Some claimed Ferdinand had slowly poisoned her. Others believed she died of what physicians of the time called melancholy of the heart, a euphemism for psychological collapse from sustained abuse. Ferdinand's reaction? Cold indifference. "Now I am free," he reportedly told a confidant, "to seek more interesting pleasures." His second wife, Isabel of Braganza, arrived in 1816, 19 years old, sent by Portugal as a political pawn to secure an alliance against liberal uprisings. Ferdinand, now 32 and hardened by years of exile, war and unchecked vice, was even crueler. He isolated her in the royal palace's eastern wing, forbade her from writing to her family without his approval, and controlled every aspect of her life, from what she ate to who she spoke with. When she resisted his advances or expressed grief over her homeland, he withheld food for days, locked her in windowless rooms, and threatened to have her brother, the King of Portugal, declared an enemy of Spain. She died in December 1818, barely 2 years into the marriage. Court physicians noted signs of severe physical trauma, bruising, malnutrition, and chronic insomnia, and described her as a woman whose spirit had long since fled her body. Her confessor, Father Miguel de la Torre, later revealed in sealed testimony that in her final weeks she prayed not for healing, but for death. "Take me, Lord," she whispered, for this world holds only torment. His third wife, Maria Josepha Amalia of Saxony, a shy and pious German princess, was married to him in 1819. Though raised in a strict Lutheran court, she converted to Catholicism to please him, only to discover that faith meant nothing to Ferdinand. She lasted 10 years, but her decline was rapid. Court diarists noted her increasing pallor, trembling hands, and refusal to leave her chambers. Though her death in 1829 was officially attributed to a sudden fever, her personal physician, Dr. Lorenzo Perez, privately confided to a colleague that she bore marks consistent with prolonged physical and emotional distress. Rumors swirled that Ferdinand was literally killing his brides, either through direct violence or by driving them to self-destruction. Only his fourth wife, Maria Cristina of the Two Sicilies, survived him, but not by his mercy. By the time they married in 1829, tertiary syphilis had already begun to eat away at his body and cloud his mind. His rages were less frequent, his stamina gone. She endured, not because he spared her, but because he was too weak to torment her as he had the others. Still, she lived in constant fear, sleeping with a dagger under her pillow and confiding to her sister, "I am married to a ghost, but ghosts can still haunt." For Ferdinand, marriage was never love. It was ownership, a transaction, a performance of power, and his wives paid for it, not with dowries or obedience, but with their dignity, their sanity, and ultimately, their lives. When Napoleon's armies marched into Spain in 1808, Europe expected Ferdinand to rally his people, to become the defiant king his nation needed. After all, Spain had resisted foreign domination for centuries. But Ferdinand saw invasion not as a call to arms, but as a chance to settle old scores. Instead of uniting with his father against the French, he did the unthinkable. He conspired against his own blood. The opportunity came during the Mutiny of Aranjuez in March 1808, a popular uprising sparked by fury at Prime Minister Manuel Godoy's pro-French policies and rumors of a royal flight to the Americas. While crowds stormed Godoy's palace and dragged him from a closet where he'd hidden, Ferdinand positioned himself as the people's savior. In truth, he had secretly encouraged the revolt. Within days, he pressured his terrified father, Charles IV, into abdicating under threat of violence. On March 19th, Ferdinand was proclaimed king, but his triumph lasted less than 2 months. Napoleon, ever the master manipulator, saw through the charade. He summoned both Charles and Ferdinand to Bayonne, France, under the pretense of mediating a family dispute. Once there, he trapped them. In a series of closed-door meetings in May 1808, Ferdinand was stripped of his illusions and his crown. French diplomats, including General Savary, recorded his humiliating pleas in detail. Ferdinand offered to surrender Spain's sovereignty, renounce his throne, place the country under French protectorate, and even convert to Protestantism. If only Napoleon would guarantee his personal safety income and future title. He signed the Treaty of Bayonne without protest, effectively handing Spain to the French Empire like a bargaining chip. Napoleon, a man who had toppled Habsburgs and Hohenzollerns, was reportedly stunned by Ferdinand's moral bankruptcy. "I have met many weak men on thrones," he later told his secretary, "but never one so vile, so devoid of honor or patriotism." Ferdinand was then exiled to the Château de Valençay in central France, not as a prisoner, but as a pampered guest at France's expense. While Spaniards rose up in brutal guerrilla warfare, the beginning of the Peninsular War, suffering famine, torture, and mass executions at the hands of French troops, Ferdinand lived in obscene luxury. He received a monthly stipend of 50,000 francs from Napoleon's treasury, hosted lavish dinners with French nobles, gambled away thousands in card games, and indulged in endless sexual escapades. He seduced local maids, coerced the wives of fellow Spanish exiles through veiled threats, and organized drunken orgies that scandalized even his French hosts. It was during this period, likely in late 1809, that he contracted his first venereal infection, almost certainly syphilis, from a prostitute in the nearby town of Château. Medical notes from his personal physician, Dr. Jean-Baptiste Lassus, later referenced a persistent ulceration of the genitalia that resisted treatment. Worse still, intercepted letters from Valençay, now held in the French National Archives, reveal the depth of his indifference. In one 1810 letter to a courtier, he wrote, "Send me news of the court, but above all, send me women. I care not for battles, only for distraction." In another, he complained about the tedium of exile, but never once mentioned the suffering of his people. To Ferdinand, Spain was not a nation to defend. It was an inheritance to reclaim, nothing more. When he finally returned in 1814, after Napoleon's first defeat, he was hailed by conservative factions as El Deseado, the desired one. But he brought back not gratitude, not reform, not even basic decency. He returned with vengeance in his heart, and a hunger for absolute control that would poison the next 2 decades of Spanish history. The man who had betrayed his country for comfort would now rule it with cruelty. Ferdinand VII returned to Spain in 1814, not as a reformed monarch, but as a vengeful autocrat hardened by exile and entitlement. Within weeks of reclaiming the throne, he issued the infamous Decree of May 4th, tearing up the liberal constitution of 1812, the very document forged in Cadiz, while Spaniards bled in the streets against Napoleon. To Ferdinand, that constitution wasn't a symbol of national resilience. It was an insult to royal authority. He restored absolute monarchy with a single stroke of the pen, then launched the Sexenio Absolutista, 6 years of brutal repression that would scar Spain for generations. But his thirst for control went far beyond politics. It was personal, intimate, sadistic. One of his first acts was to reinstate the Spanish Inquisition, not out of religious zeal, but because it gave him a legal instrument of terror with no oversight. The Inquisition's tribunals, once tools of doctrinal enforcement, became Ferdinand's private extortion network. Accusations of heresy, blasphemy, or moral corruption were fabricated with chilling efficiency. Families of accused women, often from the minor nobility or rising bourgeoisie, were summoned to secret audiences where they were given a grim choice: surrender their daughter or wife to the king's private quarters for spiritual counseling, or face imprisonment, confiscation of property, or public execution as heretics. Many chose silence over ruin. The archives of the Inquisition in Madrid contain sealed dossiers labeled Casos Reservados al Rey, cases reserved for the king, where names are redacted, but payments and pardons are meticulously logged. The royal court became a marketplace of flesh and favor. Ministers were appointed not for competence, but for the beauty of their wives or daughters. The Duke of San Carlos, for instance, secured the Ministry of Foreign Affairs after his teenage niece was installed as a royal companion. Ambassadors to London and Vienna bought their posts by offering their sisters as ladies-in-waiting, a euphemism universally understood to mean concubines. Ferdinand maintained what amounted to a secret harem within the palace walls, staffed by women trapped by fear, poverty, or royal decree. Some were given fine gowns and private rooms. Others were kept in windowless chambers near his bedchamber, accessible only through hidden corridors. His sexual rituals grew increasingly depraved. Secret court diaries, like the memorias of Chamberlain José de Vargas Ponce and later discovered testimonies from fleeing servants, describe scenes of orchestrated humiliation, women forced to perform degrading acts while masked courtiers watched from behind silk screens. Their presence was both punishment and entertainment, a way to break spirits and assert dominance. Virginity became a prized commodity. Ferdinand paid handsomely, sometimes in land grants or noble titles, for untouched girls, often sourced from desperate rural families in Castile or Andalusia who saw royal favour as their only escape from starvation. Brokers known as buscones scoured villages, promising dowries and protection in exchange for daughters as young as 14. All the while, Spain crumbled. Colonies in Latin America declared independence one after another: Venezuela in 1811, Argentina in 1816, Mexico in 1821, Peru in 1824. The treasury emptied, banditry spread, unrest simmered in every province. Yet Ferdinand remained oblivious, locked in a cycle of paranoia, lust and petty cruelty. He ruled not from the council chamber, but from the bedroom, and every decision, every appointment, every pardon, every execution was filtered through the lens of his insatiable desire for control over bodies, not borders. In his mind, the crown was not a symbol of duty. It was a key to every door, every body, every secret he wished to violate. And he turned the Palace of Kings into a prison of pleasure, where power wasn't wielded with a scepter, but with a whisper in the dark. While Ferdinand VII indulged in his private theatre of degradation, the Spanish Empire was collapsing around him at an unprecedented pace. Between 1810 and 1826, nearly every colony in the Americas declared and secured independence: Venezuela under Bolívar in 1811, Argentina in 1816, Chile in 1818, Mexico in 1821, Peru in 1824. What had once been the world's first global empire, stretching from the missions of California to the spice ports of the Philippines, was reduced to a handful of Caribbean outposts, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and a few African enclaves like Ceuta and Melilla. The loss wasn't just territorial, it was economic, cultural, and existential. Spain's annual colonial revenue, which had exceeded 300 million reales in 1800, plummeted to near zero by 1825. Banks collapsed. Trade routes vanished. Unemployment soared. Once feared and respected, Spain became a laughingstock in European courts, a cautionary tale of imperial decay. Yet Ferdinand showed no remorse, no urgency, no vision. He dismissed detailed military reports of Simón Bolívar as victories as temporary unrest among ungrateful peasants. He ignored desperate pleas from loyalist governors in Lima and Havana begging for reinforcements or political concessions. Instead, he doubled down on repression at home. Liberals who had fought against Napoleon were now branded enemies of the state. Hundreds were jailed in the dungeons of the Alcalá de Henares fortress. Others were exiled to North Africa or executed by Garrotteville in public squares as warnings. Censorship tightened to suffocating levels. Books, newspapers, even private letters required royal approval. Universities were purged of subversive professors. The University of Salamanca, once Europe's intellectual beacon, saw its enrollment drop by 70% in a decade. Anyone who questioned royal authority, no matter how mildly, was branded a traitor. His obsession with control bled into every aspect of governance. He micromanaged trivial appointments, insisting on personally approving the color of a mayor's sash in Seville, while ignoring widespread famine in Andalusia that killed over 20,000 in 1823. He spent state funds on lavish masquerade balls and new mistresses, while soldiers on the colonial front went unpaid for years, leading to mass desertions. Corruption became systemic, not because officials were inherently greedy, but because the king rewarded loyalty with sexual access, not to policy, but to his bed. A minister's survival often depended less on his administrative skill and more on whether his daughter accepted the king's ashy invitation to the royal chambers. By the 1820s, even his closest allies grew wary. The British ambassador, Henry Wellesley, wrote in 1824, "His Majesty speaks in circles, forgets names of his own ministers, and accuses shadows of plotting against him." French diplomats noted his glassy eyes and trembling hands, symptoms consistent with tertiary syphilis. The disease, now deep in his nervous system, warped his mind. He suffered violent mood swings, ordering executions at dawn and weeping over them by noon. Memory lapses so severe he once addressed his wife as "Your Majesty" in private, and delusions of grandeur that led him to believe God spoke to him through palace pigeons. Still, he clung to power with manic desperation, terrified of losing the one thing that gave him pleasure, absolute dominion over others. In 1829, in a final frantic bid to secure his legacy and block his liberal brother Don Carlos from the throne, he married Maria Cristina of the Two Sicilies, a young politically insignificant princess whose only value in his eyes was her womb. When she gave birth to a daughter, Isabella, in October 1830, Ferdinand defied centuries of Spanish succession law, the Salic law that barred female heirs, and forced through the Pragmatic Sanction of 1830, retroactively legalizing female succession. The move wasn't about progress, it was about control. But it came at a catastrophic cost. It split the nobility, militarized royalist factions, and planted the seeds of the Carlist Wars, a series of civil conflicts that would claim over 200,000 lives in the decades after his death. The empire was gone. The economy was in ruins. The people were broken. And the king, he was already rotting, inside and out. His body failing, his mind unraveling, his kingdom slipping through fingers too weak to hold it, yet still eager to grasp at flesh. By 1832, Ferdinand VII was a ghost of the man who once strutted through palace halls with arrogant confidence. Syphilis had ravaged his body, open sores covered his limbs, his hair fell out in clumps, and his speech slurred from neurological decay. He could barely walk. He could no longer ride, hunt, or even sit through a council meeting. The disease that began in bordellos and backrooms had now claimed his mind, his dignity, and finally, his life. In his final months, he was largely abandoned. Courtiers avoided his chambers, repulsed by the stench of infection. Former favorites vanished, fearing association with a dying tyrant. Even his confessor admitted the king showed no remorse, only fear of death and obsession with securing his daughter as succession. When he finally died on September 29, 1833, there were no public outpourings of grief, no candles lit in his honor, no poets singing his name, only relief. His funeral was rushed, somber, and sparsely attended. The man who had ruled with terror left behind a kingdom in chaos. His daughter, Isabella II, inherited a bankrupt state, a fractured military, and a society torn between absolutism and liberalism, a division that would explode into the Carlist Wars, claiming tens of thousands of lives. Historians have long debated whether Ferdinand was merely weak, cruel, or truly evil. But the evidence points to something more insidious. He was a man who saw power not as responsibility, but as license. License to dominate, to humiliate, to consume others for his own gratification. In an age when monarchs were expected to embody divine order, Ferdinand embodied its opposite, moral entropy. Today his name is rarely celebrated. Statues of him have been removed, streets renamed. Textbooks treat him as a cautionary tale, and rightly so, because Ferdinand VII proved that absolute power doesn't just corrupt, it perverts. It twists the soul until even the crown becomes a symbol not of glory, but of shame. He was called El Deseado in his lifetime, but history has given him a truer title, the most perverted king in history.